Brazil and X are in a war over words. In fact, Brazil's Supreme Court ordered X to suspend operation in the Latin American nation. The Supreme Court also blocked local bank accounts of Elon Musk's Starlink satellite internet firm. This is the latest chapter in a feud between Elon Musk and Justice Alexandra de Moraes over free speech, far-right accounts, and misinformation. The showdown has erupted into public view on X. Free speech advocates like Michael Schellenberger had this to say. Quote, Brazil appears to be a democracy, but it's not. President at Lula Oficial and Supreme Court Justice Alexandra de Moraes are preparing to shut down X a few weeks before the elections. Their acts are illegal and unconstitutional. It's time to call Brazil what it is, a dictatorship. So what is going on here and what is at stake? Jessica, it looks like Elon Musk is accusing Brazil of censoring free speech, or at least attempting to, by ordering X to crack down on hate speech and misinformation. And Elon Musk is saying, no, we're going to operate by the same content moderation standards that we do in the United States and other countries. And we're not going to be bullied into basically getting rid of content that the Brazilian government does not like. And Brazil is responding by saying, okay, well, then you can't operate here.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot see a world where anyone who defends the TikTok ban in the United States cannot understand where Lula and the Brazilian government is coming from. Let's not forget Latin America has been, the victim of a lot of CIA operations, a lot of intentional coups done by the US government and the deep state. And this is an American-based app where the now CEO once said, we will coup whoever we want, in reference to Bolivia. Bolivia is a lithium-rich country. Lithium is put in a lot of the batteries that Tesla cars rely on. So the idea that this is an app run by the CEO and the information may very well be in the direction of fomenting a lack of support for Lula in Brazil, that the app might be used to push a particular political agenda or narrative in Latin America. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we need some kind of control over what information people is getting, especially intentional misinformation or some kind of political agenda being pushed by a foreign government that has been hostile towards Latin American countries in the past. So, in the same spirit of the CCP has an agenda in the United States, and that's why we're banning TikTok, American people need to understand where Lula is coming from and where the Brazilian courts are coming from.
Yeah, but Brazil can't have it both ways. They can't say, well, we want the U.S. to support us and we want all of their tax dollars, but also we're not going to allow a social media company to operate here. And I think the fundamental difference in what's happening in Brazil versus what the U.S. is saying about China and TikTok is that Brazil is making a content-based decision. They don't like the fact that people are able to speak freely on X, so they don't want it to operate there. Otherwise, they would be making the same argument about places like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and other social media companies, but they only have a problem with X, which has the least amount of government influence and the least amount of content moderation. Compare that to what the United States is saying about China. Their issue with China owning TikTok, or at least their parent company being owned by China, is not that they don't like the content that's on TikTok or the content that's being pushed through the algorithm, but that there's a legitimate security issue. That's why the government has banned government employees from having TikTok on their phones, because TikTok is being used essentially as a spyware app. And because this is not a US-based company, the US consumer has no potential recourse if their data is sent back to the Chinese Communist Party. So these are two different motivations and perspectives that Brazil and the United States have when it comes to social media influence coming from foreign countries.
Yeah, I think about Bolsonaro and a lot of right-wing figures across Latin America. And I think that, what they're concerned about, specifically with X, is not so different from what, American politicians were concerned about with TikTok. They say, yes, this is about this app being owned by a foreign country, but obviously, China doesn't have as much of a stake in the war on Gaza by Israel. The US does. And so we've seen a lot of apps, Instagram and others, be not as friendly towards pro-Palestine content that people are posting. Why is that? Why is it that, companies that are largely American, run by people who have always lived in the United States, why are these apps more friendly to pro-Israel content? I think that that has its roots in American politics and the powerful people in our country. But TikTok has since changed its course since being threatened because I think these corporations, and by the way, TikTok's base in California and has changed how they do content moderation around the war on Gaza. I think in the direction of what's friendly for advertisers because their interest is profit as a big corporation, as all of them are. And so, yes, it's about free speech, but what kind of speech is being spread on X? What kind of speech are people seeing that has nothing to do with their preferences or the algorithm? I see a lot of right wing commentary and commentators that I've explicitly indicated I'm not interested in hearing from on my feed on X. So if this is an app that's pushing a right-wing agenda, as the US has done in the past in Latin America, I think I would have questions as well if I was the leader of a Latin American country as to whether or not this is an app that is being used in a way that allows for free speech, or is it being used in a way that pushes a right wing narrative? And I think that's a reasonable concern for anyone in Latin America to have, especially with an app that's American based.
Well, I suppose that would be an algorithmic question, but then you would have to determine whether or not right wing content is doing well on X because it's suppressed on other platforms, and people who are right wing might have more engagement on X because it's content that you can't get other places on some of these big social media apps. Or is it legitimately because Elon Musk is pushing that content to the top of the feed? I don't know the answer to that, but I would say that with Brazil and its government claiming that the problem with X is that it allows hate speech and misinformation, that's not even a concern about an influence on their politics. That's about them making subjective decisions about what speech is allowed on somebody else's, on a private company's platform. And that's problematic. And I don't blame Elon Musk for saying that he's not interested in changing his content moderation standards to appease a foreign government like Brazil. I mean, we've had a similar problem here in the United States, unfortunately, where Mark Zuckerberg of Meta just admitted that he caved to government pressure under the Biden administration to censor content during the COVID-19 pandemic that they deemed misinformation, a lot of which turned out to be true. He also said that he caved to pressure to de-rank and delist the Hunter Biden laptop story, which also turned out to be true. There's a current Supreme Court case involving, or not Supreme Court case, but a lower court just determined that Robert F. Kennedy has the right to sue the Biden administration for harms based on content moderation that they pushed for on social media companies. And previously, there was a Supreme Court case, Murphy v. Missouri, where epidemiologists accused the Biden administration of pushing social media companies and pressuring them under the threat of regulation to remove the Great Barrington Declaration and other sort of subversive viewpoints related to the pandemic. And although the Supreme Court found that these things had been improperly censored, they also found that these individuals did not have standing to sue. All of that to say that the Biden administration was pressuring social media companies to censor political viewpoints that they disagreed with. We are supposed to have a First Amendment in this country, and even if the government isn't explicitly throwing people in jail for saying things on social media that they disagree with, implicitly threatening a private company with regulation if they don't censor is a violation of the First Amendment. And so if we don't allow that here, we certainly shouldn't expect that Elon Musk, who says that he wants to make X a place for free speech, to acquiesce to similar demands in Brazil.
Yeah, I think the misinformation specifically in regards to free speech is what I'm talking about when I talk about political speech and maybe pushing a certain narrative that would be unfavorable to the Brazilian government, because nearly every CIA coup began with an intentional misinformation campaign over media. And media's changed over time. I don't think it's going to be like it was in the past, where it's CIA operatives trying to sound like fake militants running a radio station out of Miami meant to sound like they're in Ecuador to foment support for the opposition to the socially elected, democratically elected socialist government there. I think it's going to be a little bit different. It might be someone who is a billionaire who has interest in the material resources in Latin America purchasing a social media site and pushing misinformation to the public there. The merging together of corporations in the state has been very concerning. It's happened over time. Elon Musk works very closely with the US government, and the US government, in partnership with the CIA and multinational corporations, has been responsible for coups like this in the past. That is the deep state. And so this idea that, it's somehow benevolent because it's Elon Musk and he's a private citizen, this is a guy who's openly said on Twitter, we'll coup whoever we want in reference to, a resource rich country. And so I understand where Brazil's coming from, not wanting misinformation to fly on social media because it's been used to manipulate the public in a political direction. And they don't want the public in mass in Brazil to be the victim of Elon Musk's misinformation campaign. Why? Because he's greedy, because he wants more resources. So I get it. And I think a good solution would be, all right, you want to operate in Brazil, have a Brazilian base of X run by people in Brazil who have grown up here, and that's fine. Same solution to TikTok and the alleged CCP influence over TikTok. It needs to be bought by an American-based company. I think this could be even more friendly. You could still have X be the parent company, but everyone running it be Brazilian. Would Lula go for something like that? No, he might go for something very similar to the TikTok ban legislation. Sell it all together, have Elon Musk have no ties to the app. But I think they have some real concerns over what the direction of the misinformation would be that's pushed on X.
According to a report from the House Judiciary Committee, most of the information that the Brazilian government wants to censor is political opposition to the current regime as opposed to misinformation. They're simply labeling it that way. My closing question, I guess, would be, I know we're running out of time, would just be who gets to decide what misinformation is? Because one of the fundamental problems we saw in 2020 and 2021 was that what was deemed misinformation by the so-called experts in the United States establishment, particularly the public health bureaucracy, was not misinformation. And so we have to be very careful about who we let decide that question. And I certainly don't trust the Brazilian government or really any government to make that decision. I think that the American people are capable by themselves of figuring out what's true and what's not using their own intelligence. I think we're smart enough to be able to sort through what is true and what is false without a government nanny state deciding for us.
This is Brazil, right? Like the American people, sure, can make their decisions. The COVID story is completely different. The Brazilian people being pushed information on a website based in the US, run by a billionaire like Elon Musk, that to me seems like an entirely different scenario. And if there was a Brazilian based app that had this kind of information being pushed, there was questions about whether or not it was misinformation, it would be up to them to mediate that situation. Do I think this is Lula trying to quiet the opposition? No. I've studied Latin American politics. I really think this is a president that is trying to protect its country from the intervention of multinational corporations with clear economic interests in the region.
Yeah, the agree to disagree. I mean, the COVID-19 analogy was just that, a point to say that what is deemed misinformation often isn't, and that we should trust consumers, either Americans or Brazilians, to decide for themselves and err on the side of free speech. Again, we're going to have to agree to disagree. We'll be back with more Rising after this.